My name is Madge Busfrank, and I am the incoming president of Northern Lights Quilt Guild.
Hi, my name is Barbara Gifford. I live in Enfield, New Hampshire, and I've been quilting for about 40 years, but I've been sewing almost all my life.
I'm Jane Buskey. I live in Etna, New Hampshire. I started quilting about 30 years ago.
I'm Sharon Frank. I live in Grantham, and I started quilting in 1996.
I'm Madeline Botter from Hanover, New Hampshire.
I remember as a little one sitting on my grandma's knee, helping her sew on her treadle sewing machine. My grandma had a stash of fabric for all the quilters around.
I remember my first quilt was for my college dorm room, but I really wanted to learn more, and I read that there was a quilt class going on. And so I took a sampler quilt class, and that got me started.
I've always admired quilts, and I remember when I was a child, one time my mother put a quilt on a frame for my sister and I to work on, but we hadn't made the quilt and we were doing some of the stitching. I don't know where that ended up, but I admired quilts for a long time. And then in the mid-90s, I took a class and I've been doing it since.
Well, sewing was not my forte. I was traumatized in, I think, junior high because my mother was a seamstress and my home ec teacher. They had different ways of sewing. So I would sew one thing in home, and then I'd have to go to school and rip it out, and then I'd go home, and I did a lot of ripping out, so I swore I'd never sew. Well, I moved here in 95, and in 96, I went to a quilt show. Someone took me, and I thought quilts were kind of like fuddy-duddy, yuck fabric. Ugh. I wasn't real thrilled about it. But I went to this quilt show, and it was amazing. The fabrics were new. They were new fabrics for then. They were bright. They were colorful, the designs. And I remember with the person who was with me, I said, gosh, it would really be nice to learn how to do this. But I was really taken by it. I thought it was just amazing. And so that's how it started, with fabric and the patterns and how they complemented each other. I was really impressed with that.
I learned to sew first, and although sewing and quilting are related, there are crossover skill sets, but they're actually quite distinct and different. And I grew up the youngest of 8. There was the hand-me-downs were all done, and there wasn't a lot of money for new clothes, so I went to the local Listen store and found beautiful fabric and ripped it apart, which I learned by deconstructing how to construct. And then I had a sister who was a fabulous sewist, and she taught me how to tailor like a blazer and a full men's suit and 3-piece. So I had some quite solid sewing skills. But I didn't try to make a quilt until I was pregnant with my first baby. And I took a Hallmark card, and I didn't know what I was doing, but it was applique was the method I was using, and I made this 6-block quilt for my son, who's now in his mid-40s, and I just finished it about 6 years ago.
Yeah, it was a quilt that was started in the year 2000. You remember some people remember Y2K and how it was, what's going to happen to the world. I was with a group of quilters that retreated every year, and they always did a block exchange. So that year was our Y2K block exchange. I came home with 18 or 20 blocks, and they sort of sat in a box for a while, and then they became a top. And then I took them to Barbara, who happens to do machine quilting, and various things happened. So this quilt was finished this year, and it has all these blocks from about 20 women that it makes me remember that time together. And they made a photo block to put on the back of the quilt so I can see each of them. And so it has traditional things from 25 years ago, and it has modern quilting.
We had our challenge last year, which was pinwheels, so there's a whole section of pinwheels. And the challenge was you had to have at least one pinwheel. So my quilt has one pinwheel.
Mhm.
It's just one big pinwheel. It goes around and around and around.
The quilts that you see in the exhibit and as you come in the door and up the stairs, our goal was to really help emphasize this idea that quilting is art. Thus the name of the exhibit, Quilting and Involving Art Form. And you'll see work in the exhibit that's maybe 15 or 20 years old from a particular quilt artist who's evolved from something that was very traditional and more like the kind of quilts you might think of your grandmother making. But you'll see everything from very traditional to modern quilts and everything. But there's math, there's geometry, there's a lot of engineering, there's production. We do a lot of prototyping where we'll make a block and say, no, that's not what I want. We might cut it up and start over.
Right.
It might go from traditional to abstract, but it's this idea of the creative process that builds upon it.
I had a 4-H club when my kids were growing up, and when we started sewing, I gave them 2 sewing machines. One they took apart just far enough to figure out how it worked. The other one, they continued doing that, and then the boys in the neighborhood spent the next 2 weeks getting it down to the individual pieces. But I wanted them to learn how machines work, and then I wanted them to learn about fabric, so we did weaving, and we made paper so they'd understand felt and other non-woven fabrics. And then there's the math of trying to put, how big do you make your blocks so that if you have a size limit, and then some pieces you have to make bigger than it seems like because the way you trim them and cut them, they get smaller. So people are like, okay, I need flying geese. What size do I need, or stuff like that.
I've never took geometry in college, and so the thing I find the most difficult is if I have a queen size or a king size quilt, to do the backing. I always have to go back to the video Quilting, Quilt Backs 101, to figure out how to do the quilt back with the measurements in it. So the one I have here, I called it Asian Butterflies. And again, it was using not straight lines, which I said I would only do. So the Asian butterflies, I have circles, and so that was a real challenge. So I think it's part of
The learning.
learning.
Each one is an exploration, and a study of color and shape and things. And there's always something. I'm one of those people who say, when you stop learning, you die. So I always push myself to learn more things.
Quilting is an important art form. In some ways, we're painting with fabric. And the fabric are our tubes and our colors. And on top of that, the fabric may have texture. And on top of that, it's not really a quilt, it's just a blanket until you add batting and a backing. And then the piece that I'm particularly interested in is the surface design that's applied on the top.
Threads.
Yeah, with thread of all size, shape, and types. So I hope when people go through the exhibit, they'll be looking at that surface design, and you'll see very few pieces in this particular show that are hand quilted. Most of the quilts in this exhibit are quilted on a long arm quilting machine, and it's sort of like doodling on a robotic machine that's hand driven, and or it could be computer driven, so you can notice the differences as you look at the different quilts, and that applies a surface design that gives 3-dimensionality to the pieces. A lot of colleges and universities, particularly in engineering and art departments, are fostering collaboration. And I understand MIT now has made quilting a 4-credit course for their engineering students, and they're really encouraging folks to get in there and experiment and learn in different and very tangible ways. Quilting is very therapeutic.
Yes, I totally agree with that. Yeah, I could be so stressed out on lots of things going on in my life, but I sit down and start quilting, and it's like I'm smiling around, surrounded by this beautiful fabric,
Absolutely.
and trying to create something.
I was a clinical pastoral educator and hospital chaplain, and my job could be very stressful because I had to be at any part of the hospital where there was crisis, death, or whatever, or someone getting a diagnosis that completely changed their lives and having to be with them. And I would come home in the evening and I would spend an hour quilting, because if I thought about my work or what happened during the day, I would make a mistake. Heaven knows you don't want to make a mistake, because then you have to undo it. And so that would be my time of just, for me, it was my hour. I was sewing, I was focused, I had the color, the fabric, the feel of the fabric, and that was nourishing to my soul, and I think helped to fill up a little bit of what I had given out during the day. So I found that to be very, very healing for me, than to go back the next day and to do what I needed to do in my work and in my relationships with people.
I can say that 2 years ago I was diagnosed with not one but 2 different kinds of cancer. And one of my friends thought it was really funny before my first surgery because, well, everybody else would be worrying about what food they had in the freezer so that they have plenty of food. I was worried about cutting out fabric for quilts so that I could just sit and sew while I was healing. and she thought that was really funny, but it really got me through a lot in the last 2 years.
I had cancer a couple of times myself, and the first time it was in 2008. And you know how people always, what can I do for you? What can I bring to you? And so I asked for quilt blocks and have a quilt that was put together from those blocks. And I think it helped me and a lot of other people too.
You know, quilts are like big warm hugs that we're always giving quilts away. We have a comfort quilt group as part of our guild that when there's a fire, when kids need a quilt especially, they're offered freely.
We're passionate about quilting, and we'd like to bring in that next generation. We don't want anybody to think they couldn't do it, because of course you can, and you should.
I think anything goes, really. Like, you can imagine, I often, as a quilter, wherever I am, I see quilt. It's like I see this vision, oh, I could make a quilt out of that. Or,
Absolutely.
you know, especially if you're up in an airplane, oh my gosh.
And we do
I see
happen to
that.
have a quilt in the exhibit that is
Yes.
Sarah,
Yeah.
who's looking down from out of the window of an airplane, landing in Fort Lauderdale, and it's her impression of Fort Lauderdale from the air, with the Everglades on one side and the cityscape on the other.
Well, I think it's an amazing way to express oneself and to be creative. The modern quilts are just amazing, that push the envelope, and the use of color and the use of design, that it's not a lot of the traditional, but people who have the opportunity to make their own traditions in terms of quilting. I don't do any applique, but some of the applique quilts that I've seen, the modern ones, they just blow me out of the water. They're just amazing.
I hope when people leave the exhibit that we don't have to tell them that quilting is art.
Yeah.
I hope that they feel it. I hope they feel it with their heart and their soul and their eyes. And I would hope they'd be inspired to go home and create something.
Yeah.
The advantage of a guild is we get together once a month, either in person or by Zoom now. And we can have speakers from all over the world, especially with the Zoom meetings.
We want to invite questions about quilting, so we have left all our social media contact. We would love to have people visit the guild. We have fantastic speakers who have traveled all over the world teaching quilting, both in our community and during the winter. The Zoom meetings are super easy to get to. But we'd like to invite you, if you have any thoughts about quilting, to consider joining us. It's great fun, and I think it's a lovely artistic and creative activity that can be both singular and sometimes lonely.
Yeah.
So connecting to others who share a passion and an appreciation is an incredible opportunity.